Hi, everybody, and thank you for tuning in. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, traditional custodians of the lands on which we are here today, and extend my acknowledgement to the elders past and present of all the listeners. You're watching and listening to a Nurse Break live Q&A webinar interview. And the Nurse Break, for those who don't know, is a platform for Aussie nurses and other health professionals to share insights into their careers and promote interprofessional learning. I'm Jackson. I'll be taking you through this interview with Melanie Robinson today. And thanks for tuning into what is now our fifth live interview. The last four have gone really well, so go check them out. You can watch them all once they're recorded. If you guys are watching this live currently on the Facebook page, you can put your comments and questions below. And you can listen to this after, of course, on Spotify and Anchor and all the other platforms. Just making sure my speaker's working. What we'll do now is we'll get Melanie on and we'll start.
Hello.
Hey, Melanie, how are you? I'm just going to do a little super quick introduction.
Sure.
So everyone who's listening. So Melanie Robinson is a registered nurse with 18 years of experience, or a little bit more, I think now, working in the health system in urban and rural areas across Australia. She has a wealth of knowledge that we can all learn from. She's worked in hospitals in Derby, Fitzroy Crossing, Perth, and aged care services in Derby and Dublin and Ireland. She's worked as a nurse educator at the, I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, but the Marmudich training facility and in, oh, okay, good. And in policy in the Western Australian Department of Health. She's also completed a master's in nursing research at the University of Notre Dame in 2018, and she's currently in a nursing research role. Thank you for joining and coming on tonight on a Saturday evening.
Thanks, Jackson. Before I begin, I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands that we're all on tonight, and there's multiple of them. I have connections to Nruses and Gidja country in the Kimberley of Western Australia, and I also have an Anglo-Indian mum as well, so I'm a bit of a multicultural mix in one. Yeah, so thank you for inviting me here, and hopefully I can share some of my knowledge and wisdom with your members. Yep.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you on. I think there's so much we can learn from our Indigenous Australians and our colleagues who are Indigenous Australians. So I guess my first question would be, can you tell us a bit about yourself and how did you journey into nursing?
Okay, yep. I was one of those lucky people. I realised I wanted to be a nurse as a young child, probably around 7. It's a good time to make a career decision.
Very early.
Yeah, my auntie was a paediatric nurse, and I don't know, we've had this connection, and we're both, born in the same month, and we just had this real bond over helping and caring for people, I guess. And, as a 7-year-old, I thought, oh, that's a good career. Well, I didn't think about it as a career as a kid, but that's a good job to have. So I guess then that was always my dream. And I've had an interesting journey, growing up as a country kid in a remote, we lived on a remote cattle station, which is now a community called Nullagunda up the Gibbiver Road. If any of your listeners get up there, please have a look around. And yeah, we did School of the Air as young kids, and we relied on RFDS, or Royal Flying Doctor Service, for our healthcare, because up that way, like Northern Australia, for probably 9 months of the year, it's dry season and it's good, and then 3 or 4 months of the year, it's flooded and you can't get in, and just have an airstrip, I guess, and that's the only way to get healthcare. And all the stations have medical chests, so they have all their supplies there, and they rely on the RFDS. And back then it was a two-way radio communication. Nowadays they've got phones and internet. So my auntie that lived on the station, so I had 2 aunties that were nurses, she dealt with all the emergencies up there. She was an enrolled nurse and pretty much had to deal with heaps of really traumatic sort of injuries that you see on a long road that lots of people travel down and have accidents on. And, she was the one that had to deal with all that, and very traumatic, as well as a little community to have to go through some of the things that we saw even as kids. So
Who was she employed by? Is it like a local
No,
health
so
community?
she didn't have a job. She was just had that nursing background, and so everyone
Yep.
went to her for any sort of medical things. Yeah, so they had a really interesting journey, I guess. Yeah.
And you would have had quite a lot of exposure with RFDS. I mean,
Yeah, a lot. Yeah. Mm. You know, I mean, they used to have vehicle rollovers, you know, young people getting injured with
mm,
campfire accidents. Yeah, just lots of trauma up that road, and you had to deal with it. I guess it's a bit different now, but, you know, I really admire nurses that work up in those spaces because you
mm,
don't have all the resources and the equipment and the staff, and you're basically on your own, or there might be two of you having to deal with that stuff. So, and then we
yeah.
moved into town. So we moved into a town called Derby, which is a little place up there. And I went to primary school there, and that was a bit of a culture shock because Derby, I guess it's a big Aboriginal community there, but it's it's a struggling town, and it's getting worse now. Small towns are really struggling at the moment. And
Mm.
then I went to boarding school as a teenager to a school in Geraldton that's no longer there, with a
Okay.
bunch of,
Yeah.
it was an all girls school, and lots of us are all in the nursing profession, which is pretty
Yep.
amazing. And then I went off to Curtin University in Perth, basically straight from school into nursing. I just knew what I
Mm.
wanted to do, and I loved it from the moment I started. And a couple of years ago, WA Health did a campaign, and their catchphrase was "Nursing will take you anywhere," and it does. It honestly
Mm.
does. And if I look back at my career, I've had so many adventures because of my profession, you know, so it's
Yeah.
something to be really proud of.
Takes a girl in a small little community out to the whole wide world. Nursing
Mm.
can really do that, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, that's where you began, and then you went to Curtin, as you mentioned. Now, you were the only Aboriginal student in your cohort. So, I guess what was
Mm.
it like navigating university, and did you feel culturally safe?
Yeah, I think I don't know. In the 90s, I'm showing my age now. There wasn't, I guess, what we have now. I think we've come a long way as a country. So there was no such thing as cultural safety or recognition of the different cultures. I know in my cohort, we had a
Mm.
young Muslim girl. There was probably me, and that was probably it. Most of the other students were non-Aboriginal or non different cultures. They were all kind of white Caucasian people. But we had a lot of,
Mm.
back then, enrolled nurses had to do the full Bachelor of Nursing degree. It's a bit different now.
Okay.
They get some recognition of prior learning and stuff. So I had a couple of enrolled nurses that I really bonded with, and they'd had lots of experience. So they were
Mm.
great. But in terms of the university itself, can't fault the teaching or the
Mm.
nursing side, but I guess we didn't learn about different cultures and what that means for patients and families. We didn't back then see colour, you know, everyone was the
Mm.
same, and, you know, it wasn't a thing. But I think as
Yeah.
time has progressed, universities have seen now that your culture does make a difference to your healthcare experience.
Mm.
So we learnt a lot about, you know, all the clinical side and all the nurse care planning and all that stuff, but we didn't talk about culture at all. So I guess for me, I had to weave that into every day what I did in class. So it
Mm.
meant I had to have that voice and bring up, you know, different issues and struggles that were going on. Most universities have like an Indigenous student centre now, so
Mm.
they have that support. But as students, I was on my own. And I guess I just love nursing so much it didn't really affect me, I suppose. I just got on with it. But yeah,
Yeah.
there was no such thing as cultural safety, and we definitely didn't do
Yeah.
any additional units on culture and
Yeah.
history, and it was a different
You
world
weren't.
back then.
You probably weren't deemed as culturally aware, were you?
No, exactly, exactly. But the
um,
patients know who you
yeah.
are, you know, and
Mm.
certainly when I went on to wards, I worked in aged care as an assistant in nursing,
Mm.
all the way through my course, and I would highly encourage any student nurses that are listening to do that, because it really gives you those basic nursing skills, and you're much more confident than when you go into
Mm.
being, you know, registered and having that responsibility. But yeah, cultural safety wasn't a thing at all back then.
Mm.
But in the last, 30 years, I guess, things have changed in Australia, and it has become a bigger thing, and that's important, I think, for
Mm.
all Australians. So,
And we'll get back to more about cultural awareness and safety and sort of these terms. But you also worked overseas for a few years or a year or so. Can you talk about that quickly?
Yeah, I got an opportunity. I had a mad Irish friend who I'm still in touch with now. You know, one of them friends that you don't talk to all the time, but they're still really, close to your heart. And I still keep in touch with their family through Facebook,
Mm,
like everyone. And she said, "Why don't you come and live in Ireland with me?" And so I went over there and worked in a little old hospital that was like a rehabilitation unit.
mhm,
And I just love that experience. I love learning about other cultures and other countries, and something about the Irish that's extra special. I got to go up into Belfast as well. I've got a good friend who works in the prisons up there, and she was
mm,
one of the girls that studied with me at Curtin. And just to learn about, I guess, the history of Ireland, and that other countries have had their struggles as well, but
mm.
such an amazing opportunity. Again, if your listeners or anyone who's at the moment ready, well, not that you can travel, but going overseas just opens your eyes to the world and gives you a different perspective, I guess. And my Irish friends were interested in Aboriginal culture because they both had lived in Australia, so they were very interested in the history and the culture and the stories, and so I tried to share some of that. And at the time, and probably now, they had a lot of migrants coming from the Philippines and other countries into
Mm.
Ireland. And that was a difficult transition for them because, Ireland is usually made up of Irish people, and then they had all these other groups coming in, and that
Yeah.
created a real divide in the community. I think
Mm.
now they're all integrated, but back then it was a new thing for Ireland to
Bit of a
have,
shock. Mm,
different groups
mm.
living in their country, and the language barriers and the issues that come with that. So they loved having me as an Australian. There's always the skippy jokes and stuff, but they really
Yeah,
embraced
yeah.
having another culture there and
Yeah.
learning a bit of the history and stuff. Mm.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, so you sort of going back a little bit, you did say about the university saying, treat everybody the same, not to see color. We don't see color. Everyone's the same. We provide equal care to everybody. Um, but yeah, that's an important point you sort of touched on, I think. And we'll sort of get to that a bit later. But I mean, we are all humans, but we're not all equal.
No.
Um, okay, so I guess Aboriginals many would agree that Aboriginal nurses are probably the most suitable nurses to provide care to Aboriginal patients. I guess due to having that, you have that similar cultural background, and you can sort of cross those bridges. Health practitioners more generally, and those who provide health services, they need to be sort of particularly aware of, I guess, the historical and cultural and contemporary experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I guess my question is, what would you say are the, I guess, main things that current nurses should be aware of and reflect on?
Mm. I think that's a whole session in itself, Jackson,
A massive
because
question. Yeah.
yeah, massive question. I think the main thing to know, from what I've experienced, is don't assume about someone's identity based on their skin color. There's a lot in the newer generation, and I'm not a particularly dark person either. I think for nurses to be aware that you can't assume that someone doesn't identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander based on skin colour. That's really important. Um, I think also just to be aware that history is not something in the past, like it is something that is impacting on today. So everyone's aware of the assimilation policy and the stolen generation. That's not something that happened a long time ago. That policy ended in the early 1970s when I was born, and that has an impact now. So I always share a story of my family. My dad has four sisters and three brothers, and they were actually going to be removed by the police. So the police actually came to the cattle station, to the community,
Mm.
and they were going to actually take them away. And my grandfather was a white cattleman, and he actually bribed the police, the story goes. And then they had to say that they were Spanish, and they were sent off to boarding
Ah.
school. And that has really impacted on them. They're all still alive now. They're all hitting their 70s now, but they're
Mm.
really traumatized by that. And some days they're black and some days they're not. Like it's really
Mm.
affected their sense of self. Not only the loss of culture and language as well that happens with that assimilation policy, because kids were forbidden then from speaking language, from practicing culture. So what I say to people is that you might think that is in the past, but it's actually having an effect now. And that trauma that happened to them then gets passed down through our generations and our children as well. So I think for all our nurses and for all Australians, it's really important to know that those stories are still impacting to this day. There's still issues for now, same as I guess racism is still an issue today as well. We're seeing a bit less of the racism because it seems like it's more being targeted now to the different African and Muslim groups that are coming through. But racism is still a thing. It's always been around in Australia. Maybe, 30 years ago it was more out in the open, which sometimes I think is a good thing if you're racist, be open about it. Now it's a bit more hidden. It's a bit more overt. It's a bit more under the radar. And I guess as a black woman, sometimes I'll think, oh, that doesn't sound right, but am I just being sensitive? Because I think what happens to our community is they become hyper vigilant, and then they're always like, everything's like, oh, this could be, racism. But it is a thing. And what I would say to people is, I guess as nurses, we need to know how that history, how those issues are impacting on the community now, because we want to be able to deliver the care that we need to give and be understanding of people when they come into our clinic or our health service or our hospital, that they carry all this baggage, they could be affected by stolen generation. They could be affected by past government policies. They could be affected by policies now, that are happening as well.
And there's this generational trauma.
That
sort of
I heard
still
a
exists.
story of an emergency department screening Aboriginal patients for sexually transmitted infections, STIs. And one of the nurses who's Aboriginal said, why are you doing that? Like, why aren't you screening everybody? STIs are not just an Aboriginal thing. They're across the whole community. But this ED had this specific policy where they were screening only the Aboriginal patients. So these things sort of happen, and I don't think it's just ignorance. I don't think people deliberately be unkind or nasty. I just think they don't think about it, that there's things that go on that affect everybody. And I think this big push, this is the year of Captain Cook coming to Australia. Yay. Great. Thanks, Captain Cook. He explored all the East Coast, and he was actually a really good cartographer. I don't know if people know that. There's a show on at the Canberra at the Federal Museum at the moment about telling the parallel stories, so what it was like for the Aboriginal communities of those places that he visited as they went up the coast. Very interesting because it sort of contrasts the two stories. And within that story, there was, when he came into Sydney Harbour, there were these 3 water spouts, and apparently one water spout is not a good omen, but when there's 3, that's a really bad omen. So as you go into this display, there's these 3 water spouts and the story of what those water spouts mean. And I think for me, even with boat people, I don't understand our government's stance on boat people and that we just leave them off in an island and, do our immigration policies, because I think most of us come from boat people. Do you know what I mean? We all came on boats at different times. My mum came on a boat from England. She was a 10-pound pom on a boat. So why are we making people wait on an island and deciding if they're good for our country or not? They should be allowed to come in, and if they've come all that way on a boat and spent all that money, doesn't that show that they really want to be here? So I've never understood this government's policies on asylum seekers, and I know there's differing views on that, but I think if someone really wants to come to this country and we've got a very good country, then why can't we share that? And I think that's what's always bothered me about our community. And I guess we were raised with that real sense of social justice. So it doesn't matter who you are. If I see something that's not right, I'm going to call it out. I'm going to hold people to account. And I think we should all, as nurses, I think we're pretty good at that. I think we're pretty good at standing up and advocating and, being there for our patients. So.
Okay. So sort of taking a little bit of a different turn, but more, this is, so not talking exactly about what we just mentioned there, but so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders view health quite differently to, I guess you could say, the Western model of health, I guess. And they don't correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't recognize mental or physical health as distinct sort of medical modalities or conditions. Rather, health and medical and physical health is mental health, is sort of a more holistic approach. And, it's considered in relation to community, lands, family, and spirituality.
Yeah.
Whereas the Western model sort of denies that a holistic aspect and sort of ignores the emotional, spiritual, and social sort of elements that are underneath, the presenting problem. So I guess the question that I'm getting to is, how does the Western medical model promote hierarchy and separation of Indigenous populations? And I know it's a big question. A second aspect to it is, what is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander worldview of health?
Okay. I think it's always good
Lost connection
to look at. Yeah, you did drop in and out, but that's okay. We're professionals. I think it's really important to understand that the difference in the view, so the Western view versus the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander view, is around how we view ourselves. So in the Western way of thinking, and this is not for all cultures, but for majority, they see themselves as that individualism kind of model about yourself, your family, looking after yourself. Whereas in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture, it's actually the collectivism view. So it's about the whole community and the whole family. So I think what happens with health is we view it very different. So if the community is thriving and they're doing well and they're, managing well, then everyone feels good. Whereas in, I guess, the Western way, you're thinking about yourself and your family. I've also always teach people that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, health is not a priority. For most non-Indigenous people, health is high up on their list of important things they do. So for our community, it's way down on the list. It's way below, family obligations, cultural obligations, other commitments. So I think that makes it different. So say, I always give this really simple example that if you've got a little bit of money left and you need to buy food for your family versus buying your medication for your chronic disease, you'll buy the food for your family. You won't put your health first. It's a real simplistic example, but I think it really explains that difference. And I always go back to the definition that the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation says, is that it's not just about physical well-being of the individual, but it's also about the social, emotional and cultural well-being of the whole community. So if a community is doing well, then that's really important for the individual. And I think what becomes difficult is past experiences with a particular service. So if a family member has passed away in that service, that makes it really difficult for that person to go into that, hospital or health service and access it. So a few years ago, I had an enrolled nursing student who was going on a placement in a big hospital at home in Perth, and she was freaking out. And I was like, what's wrong with you? Like, what's going on here? And the ward she was actually going to, her grandfather had died there 12 months before, and she was in a complete panic. So I did a lot of work with her, working through what that experience was like, what was good about it, what she didn't like about it. And we talked through a lot of it. But then what I had to do was just convince her to go and have this different experience as a nurse. And she went in and she had the best placement and she saw a different side and she actually felt good about it. But it would have been really easy for her to say, I'm not going, I'm not doing it, And I think hospitals and systems create this fear and this anxiety, and they do it for everyone. I don't care who you are. If you have a bad experience, it stays with you, especially if you lose a loved one in a hospital. But for our community, there is that real fear, especially for the older ones. They're scared of doctors. Like, they won't ask questions. They won't speak up when they don't understand something. They get really worried because they have a lot of respect for the hierarchy in the system, like doctors are like the top of the chain. Nurses also talk a different language. Like, there's that real medical jargon and the lingo that we talk, and they don't understand. And then add on to that cultural difference as well makes it really challenging, I think, to go into a service and feel confident and be able to ask questions and be able to advocate. So what you'll often see is when people are coming in, they might get really aggressive, they might be abusive, and sometimes that's connected to their fear and their anxiety of past experiences and that Western model of care as well. It's a different way of viewing the world. And I know in nursing we talk a lot about holistic care, caring for the whole person. But I think more and more over the last 30 years, I feel like we've become more specialised and more disease-focused. And we've really gone down that medical road. And I think for us as nurses, it's time to go back to what we are about, which is more than just the disease or the illness. It's actually about the whole person, what's going on for them, what's going on in their life. But as we become more specialised and more technological and all that stuff, I think we've forgotten who we are as a profession and what we're there for as well. And I'm all for skills, so
yeah.
I've worked in EDs and ICU and all that. I love all that, machinery. Like, I think there was a post on your nurse breakdown with all the pumps and things, and I get all excited looking at veins or whatever. But
yeah, I put a photo of some nice juicy veins for people and to pop some cannulation tips up. But I think what you said, I think it's true. I mean, medicine, the medicine has been broken into so many modalities. You have orthopedics and oncology. Like that those nurses and those doctors only focus on that sort of issue, missing the bigger picture, I guess, is what you're sort of trying to say. I guess sort of following on from this is that, okay, so we've sort of agreed that medicine is very Western-centric, white-centric, you could say, and sort of ignores a lot of other cultures and lived experiences that exist. I guess science isn't culturally bound, and it's been around for a long time before Australia was colonized. And therefore healing isn't either. It isn't culturally bound either. So I guess, how do we blend the best of Aboriginal science, which is at times not measurable and not verifiable? Well, it's measurable and verifiable in different ways to, modern Western science. So I guess my question is, how do we bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture back into medicine and nursing?
Well, there's some interesting, I don't know if your followers know about the Ngungkuri healers from the Central Desert. So South Australia Health now have I don't know, it's like an item number, I guess, and they actually get paid to come into the service, and they're not just about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander patients, they'll see anybody. And the healers come in, they don't do heart or renal, kidney stuff, but they'll do anything else. And they do traditional healing on them. And there is no science behind that, which has always been tricky. But the South Australian health system has embraced it. And they actually come in and do these healing sessions with the patients. And they're seeing I guess, I don't know, it's really hard to describe, but it seems a bit like Reiki to me, but it's totally different, but it's that similar sort of process. And they do this healing and they're really getting results with it, and they're travelling all up and down, well, prior to COVID, all up and down the APY lands and into South Australia as well. So I think one thing I want to say is that in the health system, if we could embrace these alternate models, and I know we're very sciencey and that's really difficult for us, but if a patient says to you, I want to see a Ngungkuri healer, then we should make that happen. Like, do you know what I mean? We should allow that, and the health system should allow that. Patients use alternative medicine all the time. We just don't ask them. I know quite a few cancer patients that use the maroon bush tea. You can buy it online now, and you brew it up. It comes in bags, or you can get the leaves. And that has really good medicinal properties, not just for cancer, but for other conditions as well. So I think more and more we're seeing the local communities are writing down what's available and also sharing that, but they're starting to use it as well. So I know patients that come from remote areas, some of the communities are starting to create ointments and other things that can be used as part of a complement, I think, with traditional medicine as well. I think the two should go hand in hand, and I think we've got to be more open to that. And I think we're now asking patients, what are you using, so we can check that there isn't any interactions or issues with that. But I think we need to be more embracing, because people are going to use these things and we might not even know about it, So there's a lot of work going on. There is fear in the community, genuine fear. They don't want pharmaceutical companies and others getting a hold of these recipes and, I guess, making them into a multi-million-dollar business. They want to keep it protected. So some of the communities are happy for these things to be used for people from that community, but they won't share it with others because they're really nervous that some big company's going to take it off. And I guess we've seen that with pawpaw ointment and lavender and other things where they've just made it into a massive market, So I think we've got to balance that cultural respect, but also embracing that some of these traditional healing methods have merit in our system. They're not going to cure everything, and you still got to use your mainstream treatments, but, they complement in a way. And there's things as nurses that we can use that will help us as professionals as well, like you see now with mindfulness and yoga and things like that. I think that makes you a better clinician if you start taking on board some of those, different ways of doing things. Yeah.
Are you able to sort of mention what are the traditional healers? There's healing songs and the sort of bush medicine. Is there any other examples you can think of the top of your head?
Where they complement mental health. I always talk West Australian context. Sorry, everyone, but that's where I'm from. But
that's in the
Mental Health Act over there. They actually, so some of our community, when they get diagnosed with a mental illness, there is a cultural component to that. So they can actually be, it's called being sung. So if you've done something wrong, it's like a punishment, I guess. And what they've started saying in the Mental Health Act is that they can get like a medicine man. Different communities call them different things, but basically a medicine man. And they'll come in and actually do like this whole session with someone who's a mental health patient just to check it's not actually a punishment or they've been sung, to find out if there's something else going on as well. So that's another thing I'm aware of. I think there is a lot of stuff out there, and like I say, patients might not be telling you unless you ask them those questions. Are you using any sorts of alternative medicine or traditional medicine? I think it's a really important question to ask and be comfortable to ask that question as well.
Okay. So for Indigenous health workers, I guess, how do they sort of navigate, from your experience, nurses in particular, how do Indigenous nurses navigate the Western medical model that sort of dismisses that traditional form of healing?
Yeah, it's really tricky because I guess, you're wearing different hats all the time. We all do. But, obviously being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or both, and then being a nurse or a midwife or, whatever profession you're in, I think it's really tricky sometimes because families will tell you things that they don't want anyone else to know. And you've got to kind of weigh up, I guess, a bit like a lawyer, weigh up, whether this is relevant or whether we should share. I think it's really difficult, and I see a lot of burnout in our population of nurses anyway, because you're trying to balance, and the further out you get and the remoter you get, it gets really difficult. So if someone passes away or you're involved in their care, the community look on that in sort of a negative light. So you're trying to balance, I guess, your cultural responsibilities, but also be a clinician. And it's really tricky to do both. But really important, I think, that we are represented in the system, but how do you balance out your cultural obligations as well? So I'll give you an example. As an Aboriginal woman, I've got to be careful when I'm nursing Aboriginal men, especially old elders and traditional men. So I had a patient, real old traditional guy, didn't speak a word of English, from the Central Desert, and was really unwell, and they couldn't work out what was going on. And I went and kind of just sat with him, and we couldn't communicate because we didn't speak language. And back then we didn't have interpreters for Aboriginal languages like we do now. But I can't shower that man because that wouldn't be appropriate, and it sort of leads into that men and women's business that we're going to talk about later. But I had to be really careful because I'm a woman and he's a traditional man, and there's limits with that. And we see that sometimes with our young men that are going through law. So law is when they go from being a boy to being a man. So there's all this process they go through. And you've got to be really careful because those young men aren't allowed to be alone with women. Like they're going through law to become a man, and there's strict rules around that. And our professions are majority women, so imagine that patient having a mental health issue and you're trying to deal with that and you're a woman and you're not supposed to talk to him, you know. So
how does that get dealt with? Like how does that work?
Sometimes they'll ask for a male clinician, and that's okay within reason. But what they'll do is they'll make sure that like their dad or another man will be present, and you've got to ask certain questions, and there's things you can't ask, so they'll tell you that, you know, there's some things you can't ask them, and it's very tricky to navigate, and it's very tricky for that patient, you know, especially a young man who's, you know, under strict rules and laws and things. Yeah.
So if a female nurse in Australia decided to go rural and remote for a few months somewhere in an Aboriginal community, is this something that they will face when they look after male patients?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And I think there's ways around it. I think you've got to be really respectful. And I know we all are, I think, of different genders when we're caring for them. But yeah, like I wouldn't go into a shower with an older man without getting consent, and, you know, you do all the right things and stuff.
Yep.
But if they refuse, then you've got to respect that as well. And that's really hard when you're trying to do your job and trying to get things done. So it's just about balancing the two. But I think if you are going into rural and remote areas, to be really mindful that there's still a lot of those traditional practices going on. So often what the service will do is do some sort of training initially so you're aware of what those things are, you know, and what they mean as well. So
okay, so you're okay?
Yeah.
So yeah, there are these cultural practices such as caring for country, death and grief, which is, I think, sorry business, law and law, as you mentioned, and men's business and women's business. So let's sort of tackle each of these separately, but what is sorry business, firstly?
Yep. So sorry business it's even before someone passes away. So if there's been like an accident or some sort of injury, it sort of kicks in straight away, and it goes through that whole process from when they pass away and beyond as well. So different communities kind of practice it a bit different. There's the whole process. So if you've got a patient in a hospital, a lot of family and community will come to that hospital, and that's sometimes challenging when you don't have the space to host all those people. And we have strict rules, you know, in intensive care and ED and stuff about how many people can visit, and you might end up with 50, 60, 100 people turn up, you know, and how do you manage that? That's the beginning of that sorry business. When someone does pass away, and particularly if they pass away off their country, that's a big deal. That's a really big deal for the community. So there might be practices that come with that. One of the things that we see a lot with sorry business is the smoking ceremony. So often their house or wherever they've lived, they'll actually smoke it traditional way. And that's about releasing that spirit as well. Obviously, in a hospital, if they pass away there, it's really difficult to do. You can't smoke the hospital, but they'll do some sort of ceremony. Some communities will cut some hair and take some hair with them. Some will want, you know, different things done, and they'll tell you what they need in terms of that. And then what sorry business is, I guess it's a bit like, you know, that grieving and that funeral process that most people go through, but it's sort of a bit bigger than that. So with sorry business, there's kinship obligations. So about who goes to the funeral, how long they stay around, who they support in the family. Like there's all these sort of rules that are different in every community, but, you know, just to be aware of. And then it goes through the whole funeral, and there might be a period of time after. I always use the example of saying someone's name. So when someone passes away, some communities will not say their name again for a long time. It's the same with photos as well. They won't show images of that person for a long time, and that's all part of that sorry business. People often ask me, you know, when you see presentations and TV shows, why do they put up that warning saying this contains images of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may have passed away? Well, that's all part of that warning. There is a whole protocol on how long before you can say someone's name, show their image, all that sort of stuff. And you might never say it again, like, you know, that amazing singer from the Territory from Elko Island that died, you know, a year ago. We still don't say his name. Like, you'll see him mentioned as Dr. G or his surname. Like, people really careful of that. And that's until the community says now you can use his name and his image, but out of respect, there's a period with that. So sorry business is quite complicated. There's obligations on who goes to the funeral. And what I often see with the workers that I support that are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, they are getting called to lots of funerals. So what some families will do is say, we'll nominate these people to represent our family, because obviously if you're working, you can't always be going to funerals and stuff. The more important that person is to that community, the bigger the funeral is. So a big funeral, you could have 300 or 400 people come to a funeral. And I mean, that's a real shock, I think, for non-Indigenous people to understand that. Like, all these people just come from everywhere. And the more important they are, the more people there are that come to that. There's also some trickiness around sorry business as well. If there's something that's happened and an Aboriginal person has caused the death of another Aboriginal person, there could be some sort of punishments around that as well, and some sort of payback. A few years ago, I did some training with some palliative care nurses, and they were really upset because there was a young Aboriginal guy dying in their service and no one came to visit. But what I had to explain to them was he'd actually been in a motor vehicle accident and someone had died. And basically under tribal way, they weren't allowed to visit. That's actually their punishment. So it's not that they didn't want to visit. They were told by the community and by the elders, you are not allowed to visit him because that's his punishment, you know. So it's really difficult to understand when you haven't grown up in that world and you're like, he's dying. Like, why can't we go see him, you know? So it's very complicated, but it's essentially someone dying and then passing away, and that process of grieving that goes on. But it's different in every community as well, you know.
So it sort of changes between each community as well.
Yeah. And that's if you do go into rural and remote, and even in the city hospitals, because patients come down to the city, ask the family what they want to do, what their process is, you know, how they want to keep connected to their country, because dying off country is a big deal for Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait communities as well. So over the last 30 years, what we've pushed a lot of the doctors to say is, rather than retrieving someone and taking them to the city, do we really need to do that? Are they going to, you know, is there treatment? Are they going to survive? If not, keep them on country, keep them dying where their family can all be around them and where they feel safe as well. So I notice now a lot of patients aren't being transferred to the city if there isn't a good outcome or prognosis connected to that, and that's a good thing. So,
do you find advanced care plans are a thing used in Aboriginal communities? Is that something that's
it's a bit like
used?
organ donation. I don't think we've done enough to promote it. I think it would be a thing that community would be interested in, but I think we need to do more work. It's a bit like, I would say to people, palliative care is a bit the same. It's what we call it, because people think of palliative, oh, you've given up, you're dying. But palliative is actually really beneficial for lots of people. So I think advanced care planning is something we should be talking about with our communities. I don't think we've done enough work in that space, Jackson, and I don't have a view on it because we haven't talked to enough community yet about it. But I think it's really important. And I know renal patients, they're starting to use that advanced care planning with them, you know, and talking about your options and do you want to be doing dialysis for the next 30 years, you know.
And I mean, that's another whole topic as well. How do we do this dialysis in rural and remote areas? Just for everyone who's watching this, guys, you can still post your comments on Facebook. There's a few people who are. So if you've got questions for Mel and you want me to ask them, just pop down any of your questions. This is the one and only time we can do that. So to the next sort of part of the question is, what is men's business? And I guess, what would a non-Indigenous nurse need to know about these sort of things?
I think there is that real gender difference. I certainly know men and women don't like being put in the same room together. And I think in our hospitals now, we put everyone in one spot. We can't We don't have this space to put different genders in different, that's really difficult, especially for the older men and women. So there is a real separation. In communities, there is some things that only men talk about, and there's things that only women talk about, and they're two separate things, and they cannot cross over. So just to be aware, I think, when you're nursing patients, and like I was saying with that old man, I knew that as an old man and me as a woman, that there was some things that we couldn't talk about, even though we couldn't communicate. But, I had to be really careful of that, because there is topics that are separate. So what we'll often do if we're educating about STIs or something specific to a gender, we'll make sure no men are there, because there is that sort of sense of shame and embarrassment. But also there's some things that should be kept separate as well. So it is a thing. And same for men. Being a woman, you've got to be mindful of that. And I think there's enough male nurses, not enough male nurses yet in our profession, but there's some coming through. So you're able to do that. But obviously when you've got a patient load, you can't be, you've got to do what you can do. But just be mindful of it, I think, to be aware that, some men get really embarrassed if there's a woman in the shower with them or talking about something to do with the men's, bits or whatever it is, just to be mindful of it. Not that sometimes you can't do anything about it, but just to be aware that there is a difference and there is deep embarrassment and shame connected to that conversation being had as well. So just gauging, I think, just to be mindful as nurses of people's body language and what they're not telling you, and just watching their face and how they are when you're talking about things, and then I shouldn't really be going down this road. I might need to get someone else to have this conversation with them. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess that's sort of the same for women's business, just the opposite gender. Yeah. Okay. Well, before we got some more questions, we'll go to some questions that some people have posted.
Do you know what we've been doing? We've been yarning. We've
been
around and round, Jackson.
So I totally missed all that. You just cut out. So what was that?
I was just saying we were having a yarn. It seems like it goes around in circles, but it comes back at the end. It's called yarning.
No, I love it. Good. I love a good yarn. Yeah. Libby Murray has asked you, I'm a mental health nurse. I have seen Anna, I don't know how to pronounce that. Yep. Anagu, who were sung. It is very hard to watch in the deterioration. Is there something as we as practitioners able to do? So can you just quickly go back again and explain what is being sung? What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a punishment. They might have done something wrong, so they might have had a relationship with someone they shouldn't have because of the skin groups. It says who you can have relationships with. And basically it's like a traditional kind of punishment, I guess, and it can make someone really sick. And I think as a practitioner, it's really frustrating to watch because you're trying to manage symptoms, but you don't really know what the cause is. So how can you really treat it? I think one of the things you can do is get in touch and try and find a traditional healer, try and find a medicine man or someone that can come in and intervene. But if it's a punishment from the community, there's probably nothing you can do, and that person will probably pass away, and that's really hard to watch, definitely. But it doesn't mean you can't try, and we always want to help our patients. So I would be getting in touch with the elders and saying, what can I do here? What's this about? Why is this happening, sort of thing. So yeah, there's not a lot you can do, but you can try and reach out and see if someone will come and visit that patient and give them some traditional healing.
Okay, I think that's some really, really solid advice. Libby has also asked another question. I won't pop it up because it's a very long one. It will cover our faces. But she has said that we don't have enough male nurses in the communities to fulfill I can't pronounce that. I'm really sorry. Especially in aged care. I'll put it up so you can see. Especially in aged care and looking after the male elders. So female nurses have to do the ADLs, young females mostly. I don't think this is appropriate. I feel more Indigenous employment of males should be encouraged.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think, males are underrepresented in our mainstream anyway, but also in our Aboriginal population. Potential solutions are that assistant in nursing workforce, that being promoted as a pathway. I think our boys are even more behind the mainstream boys in seeing nursing as a pathway. And I think there's lots of work to do there as well. But I think, you know, when you're working in that sort of aged care space, it's really difficult to get, you know, that gender balance. And I think you just got to do what you can do to sort of maintain people's privacy and dignity in that space, you know.
Is aged care prominent in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities? I mean, I'm going to assume there's not many
Well,
facilities. Like, is the care provided by families or?
yeah, what we see is that more families keep people in the home. It's a bit like reminds me of Indian, you know, families and also Vietnamese. They tend to keep their oldies at home more.
Yeah.
Same in our communities. In saying that, some of the oldies are neglected because people don't have the skills to look after them. But I think we have got some dedicated aged care services. Again, staffing them has always been an issue. But lots of our mob don't make it past 55, 60. You know, they're dying from chronic disease and diabetes and renal failure and stuff. But we do have more people getting older and older. They tend to be a bit more independent, and when they do need care, they tend to go into the high care services. But again, the further you go out, there is dedicated services that are specifically for our population as well.
So I sort of wanted to ask. So you mentioned a lot earlier that, you know, health is definitely low on that priority for many in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Do you think that's a good thing, or is there a way to, you know, rank it a little bit higher? Do we need to do that to, you know?
I think as a community, we definitely need to push it up the chain. I talk to a lot of people about, you know, if you don't care for yourself, how can you care for others? You know, you need to put your health as a priority. I know with the Close the Gap prescriptions, it means that medications are more affordable. So if you identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, your GP can write you a Close the Gap CTG script, and then you get it at that pension rate if you've got a chronic disease. That's made it more important. But I think as a community, we need to educate more about the importance of health and looking after your health as well, and balancing that with your cultural and your other obligations too. I think it's always going to be like this. I don't know. It's just a different view of the world, I guess. But yeah, you're right. We need to have more of these conversations so we can encourage people to look after their health and well-being. So.
We'll go to another question by Ben Jenkins. Ben has said, loving this episode. So thanks, Ben. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Do you have any strategies when caring for an Indigenous patient's family in the critical care setting? How should I modify my language to deliver the information of what is happening? It's an awesome question, Ben.
That's a great question, yeah. Critical care is scary and overwhelming for anybody, as all us critical care nurses know. I think there's a lot you can do, and you're probably already doing it, Ben, you know, in terms of making sure families are prepared for what they come in and what they see. You know, a patient in the critical care space doesn't look like the person they know. You know, they're often got a lot of fluid and they look different. They've got tubes and machines. So doing that initial preparation and really keeping the family informed about what's going on, having those family meetings. And with our community, there might be one person who they nominate as that sort of spokesperson that you can talk to and explain what's going on. But having those regular daily meetings. If language is an issue, it might be worthwhile engaging an interpreter, and there's lots of Aboriginal interpreting services now that you can get in touch with, just to get some of the key messages across to the families as well. So making sure to be mindful if English is a second language that you do engage those services. We talk a lot of jargon, and we talked about this before, you know, Jackson, that we need to make sure how we communicate is understood by the person who's sitting in front of us, and we do talk a lot of jargon. What's really good as well, if you can do it, is those images and photos from home as well. I'm not sure how accessible they are, but, you know, and now we've got everything on our phones and things, but ways you can sort of make people feel more comfortable. I always find hospitals are very white. and very plain. And so, you know, if they can, you know, hospitals should be putting up artworks and images and, you know,
100%.
posters and things to make people feel comfortable. And I know you've got to balance out that infection control side with the, you know, what makes it comfortable and welcoming. But
I've never understood why they're so ugly and so white, and why we can't make them colourful and fill the corridors with artwork.
You know, the blood and the poo and all the other stuff we see, like, and we have all these white uniforms and white hospitals, you know. Well, we don't have white uniforms anymore. But, you know, I think things like the Koori Mail, having that around in the waiting room so families can look at that. Just anything, posters, images. You've got to be careful with images, I guess, of people if they've passed. But, you know, definitely paintings and other things. And I know a lot of hospitals are now investing money in purchasing artworks and stuff. And, you know, for an Aboriginal person or a Torres Strait Islander person coming in that room and seeing an image, even if it's not from their country, is really powerful and really important. Keeping your language simple, making sure people understand what you're saying, you know, what you're telling them about their loved one's condition, you know, making sure they understand what that means. Keeping connected with their community. So if they've come off country to come into your critical care space, how do you maintain that contact with their family as well and their local medical service? You know, they might be in an Aboriginal medical service or another service that they use. How do you maintain that communication of what's going on? And then that's really critical with the discharge planning as well. But critical care is a scary space for anybody. It's just making people feel comfortable. And I find, I've got to say, you know, in my time in critical care and also nowadays when I talk to families that have been in that space, we do a good job. I think given the circumstances that we're in, we do a lot to support families in critical care and make them feel comfortable and stuff, you know. My dad had an overnight in ICU 2 years ago and the staff were wonderful to us. They were really amazing. So just making sure people understand what's going on, they're being communicated with and they're being included in the conversations, but keeping the jargon down to a minimal and just talking, you know, plain English is really good. And yeah, if we can make that environment a bit more welcoming as well, that's good. A bit of colour, you know, a bit of, you know, I don't know, it's really tricky because of infection control and you've got to wipe everything down and stuff, but, you know, making it a bit more friendlier is good.
It sort of reminded me to ask this question. I guess the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has sort of exposed the vulnerabilities and inequality, I guess, between non-Indigenous and Indigenous, you know, in regards to, I guess, overcrowded housing and, you know, the difficulties with isolation. And I guess, you know, an over-reliance on Centrelink, chronic disease, substance abuse, and all these things. And I guess that would, you know, result in more critical care presentations. How has COVID-19, I guess, impacted you and your community from your experience?
Yeah. I've got to say, considering all things, we haven't had that many infection rates, which has been fantastic. And I think a lot of that's to do with the public health messaging and the way the country as a whole has dealt with this. Different states and territories have sort of done it different. But I know in terms of the overcrowding, when someone has been diagnosed, they've made alternate arrangements to keep them in that sort of isolated space away from the family and stuff. One of the biggest issues, I guess, that it's highlighted is the issues around food security. And I know the Commonwealth Government are doing some work to look at the remote stores and the pricing. I don't know if you've seen, but like, you know, a 6-pack of toilet roll might cost you $38 in a remote community, you know. So, you know, whereas down the street it's maybe $6 or $4, you know. So they're looking into all that pricing stuff. I think it's highlighted the strength in our community. So the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak bodies have done a lot of work around messaging and making sure the messages are delivered in a culturally safe way that's understandable. And that's really made a difference. Community have talked a lot about a lot of confusion between Commonwealth messages and their state and territories. There's been a bit of a clash there, and that's a lesson, I guess, for all of us to learn post-COVID, that how we communicate is really important and what messages we're telling people are really important, because it starts getting confusing for people. But I think as a community as a whole, we've just stepped up and gone, we're going to take care of the business ourselves. I've got to hand it to the Aboriginal Medical Services. They've done a super job. You know, they've opened respiratory clinics. They've been doing screening. They've been doing a process as patients come through clinics. It's been really well managed. I don't think we could have done much different. I don't know, being a policy person, I think public health policy on the run is sometimes tricky. And I'll use the example of, you know, elective surgery being cancelled, but then no one thinking about, you know, there's 6,000 nurses that work in elective surgery and, oh, no, they'll have no work now. So sometimes that public health policy is for the greater good, but people don't think about the impact that's broader. But I think in terms of our communities, we've done quite well. Where we've sort of fallen over is some of the border restrictions and the movement, because staff haven't been able to get out to remote communities and towns to work and replace other staff who maybe, you know, need a break or whatever. Access to PPE has been a massive issue, and I don't think that's just an issue for our community. I think it's been an issue across Australia.
Everywhere.
But, yeah, I think we've done really well considering how quick it all happened. And we haven't had any cases. We've had some in the Kimberley, but we haven't had any in any of the remote communities, which is fantastic.
It's great.
And that was all to do with border restrictions and making people isolate when they go into communities and stuff. And we have had some cases in the urban areas, but they've managed it really well. My biggest worry, and I said it to all the government meetings I've been to, is management of chronic disease. So, you know, that's sort of fallen over because people aren't going to their GPs and aren't going to get that care that they need. And I'm really worried about chronic disease management and what that means when you're not taking care of your chronic disease. But also, I think I'm worried about the mental health of our frontline healthcare providers, but also our community as well, you know, especially the communities that had bushfires and then had pandemic, but also communities that have had pandemic. You know, I really worry about that isolation and what that's done to people. And I know the rates of alcohol use have gone up, and that's not a good thing because then there's often family violence and other things that come with that. So I think COVID has really tested us, but I got to say we have an amazing healthcare system. And if we didn't have all the public health legislation and stuff, we could not have kicked in as good as we did. And we've done a really good job. So, and I think certainly for our community, we're pretty proud that the infection rates have been really low and really well managed. But there's lots of lessons to learn, as you know, when there's any sort of crisis like this. So, but I think we've been lucky. We've been very lucky as a country and as a community.
And Victoria today, actually, we've just had our restrictions tightened again. We've had some more cases, but
that was going to happen anyway. We knew that.
To be expected, yeah. Dazza Martin has asked, has said, one of the things I loved about working in community as a male nurse was being able to talk men's business.
Oh, great. We need more Dazzas in the world.
What's another one we've got? Margaret, thanks for asking this question. Can you speak about the inclusion of First Nations cultural awareness in all under and postgrad nursing courses as a means for nurses to be better equipped to help close the gap?
Yeah. I think we're doing pretty good at this, especially in the undergrad space. I know there's some good programs in the postgrad, but I'm more familiar with the undergrad. I think a part of the struggle is the consistency in the way it's being taught. So one thing I see a lot of is there's not enough Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics teaching the curriculum. So it's reliant on non-Indigenous people, and that's sometimes an issue in the way it's communicated as well. I think for postgrads, there needs to be more, same as with the undergrads. There's a national Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health curriculum framework now, which provides guidance on what should be taught, how it should be taught, how it should be assessed. And I really encourage people who are in that academic space to refer to that. The Australian Nursing and Midwifery Accreditation Council has done a lot of work to make sure that curriculum is there, but it's the way it's being taught as well. I think a big issue for Australia is it's not taught in school. So the Black history of Australia isn't a part of the school curriculum. Some states and territories do a little bit, but it's not enough. So when kids are coming into uni, and even mature age students, they often don't know a lot of the history and a lot of the culture. So I think that's the unis are doing a lot more than they're doing in secondary school. But yeah, there's a long way to go with that. And that's, I guess, one of my challenges for all the nurses that are online and that see this is go out and challenge yourself to learn more of that history, even if it's just going to an art show or watching a film. We had Australian Dream last year, the story of Adam Goodes. It's a really good movie to watch because it really gives you an insight into his journey, but also some of the broader Australian contemporary issues. We've got so many amazing Indigenous films coming out. So if you get an opportunity to go watch a film or go to an art show or just do some reading, I'd encourage you to do it because that's a way to learn more. But I think as an undergrad, you do get quite a bit of content now, and it's very good content. So I think that lived experience is really important. Like, I don't know, for me, I can read a book. I love books, they're great. But talking to a real life person is pretty phenomenal, So if you get that opportunity to sit down next to someone and hear their story and they want to share it, then do that. Take that opportunity. A lot of the old people and the elders want to tell you those stories about what it was like for them. But we've got more content coming out. SBS and ABC are always doing great programs. Get online. There's heaps on. I mean, some of the videos on YouTube aren't good, but there's some good ones there. But yeah, just get involved. Like I see stuff all the time. There's been some great programs lately, and I'm expecting with the Black Lives Matter that there'll be more programs coming out about what's going on. But yeah, just get yourself out there and ask questions and learn.
A question that sort of goes off this is there cultural blindness in health and nursing, and is just teaching cultural awareness at the undergrad level for healthcare professionals, is that enough, or so that's sort of the question.
Yeah, I think that there is. I wouldn't say it's cultural blindness. I just think people are just, I don't know, I think they're getting more aware, but then they're feeling a bit powerless because they're like, what can I do? How can I be a better nurse or a better clinician? I think that is, we've done cultural training for a long time and I still see gaps. I still see, even with COVID, there was the odd racist incident where people were being judged, when they went in for screening or why are you here sort of thing. I don't think that's because people have got any malice or hard feelings. I just think it's, not being aware and being, not thinking a bit different, I suppose. So I think for me, the challenge is you can do cultural awareness training and it's really important you do that and you need to know about what's going on in your community. But how do you change your own behaviours and your own beliefs and your own values? Because what I guess cultural safety teaches is that it's not just about your ethnicity. It could be about your sexuality or your gender or whatever it is. But as a clinician, I've got to reflect on where I sit and who I am, and then how I use my own values, attitudes, and beliefs to look at others. So it's really important. I think we all know how to do self-reflection, that when you're in a particular scenario, to go away and think, how could I have done that different? What did I do? Was that family happy with the care I gave? Did I ask them if they felt safe in that encounter? So for me, you can do all this learning and training and education, but it's really about the practical stuff. How do I sit in front of someone who's different to me, whether it is about race or gender or whatever, and make them feel safe? What do I need to do that? And I think the biggest thing I say to people when I do the workshops is it's all about listening and being respectful. And that doesn't matter where you come from. If you're a good listener and you show respect, the patients will give you that back and the families will as well. Yes, we've got patients and families that have got mental health issues and other things, drug and alcohol issues going on. And, I don't tolerate violence at all. No violence is allowed. But most families, when they do get aggressive, it's because they're frustrated and they're not feeling heard and they're feeling invisible. And if you start unpacking that and sit down and just, treat them with respect, but they have to respect you back, then that's really important, I think, to build that relationship. But I think training on its own isn't going to solve the challenges that we have, you know.
I mean, it's going to help with the interpersonal racism, but I guess there's also 50% of it is also the institutional and structural racism, and you know
Right.
the racism within the services themselves. So it's an important role, but I think it's only part of it to stop the racism actually occurring. This is sort of a little bit different, but I know you're a passionate research nurse. What is restorative health?
I think we try and do restorative health. So it's about when someone leaves our health service or our hospital and what happens after in terms of their health to get them back, I guess, to their optimal health and well-being. And we sort of do this in discharge planning. And I think one of the things I would say to all the nurses online and that see this is that you need to know what services are available in your community, you know, what is out there in terms of the primary healthcare context as well. Because the part of restorative health is not only getting someone through their illness or their disease and discharging, and it's making sure that they continue on what's needed to get themselves back to being a healthy individual again and get themselves back to work or whatever it is they do. And I think as nurses, we have an important role to play in this. And I think we do focus a lot, like we said before, on the disease or the illness and caring in the medical way. But we don't often think about what happens when they leave the door and how do they get care closer to home so they can return to whatever their life looks like, you know, and it's hard to define for everybody. But I think as nurses, we have an important role to play in that, you know, into that planning and into that getting them back and linked up with the services that can give them the care that they need or the support or whatever it is. And we try to do that, but we're so busy doing other stuff. And I guess something I always did when I was on the floor was discharge planning started from admission. It wasn't something you just thought about on the last day. You should be planning that the whole way through. I think now with the turnover and the moving, it's harder because we don't have that continuity of care with patients and we might be caring for multiple people in a week. But, you know, as much as we can, start talking to patients and saying, what do you need when you get home? You know, do you have proper food? Do you have a doctor nearby? You know, how do you get care? And starting those conversations. So then if we're aware of things that are available in their community, maybe we need to link them up to these other things. So it's important.
Okay. That sort of sums that one up. Look, the next few questions are a little bit all over the place.
That's okay.
You know what? Let's do it. Let's do it. So 2020 is as we all know, the World Health Organization's year of the midwife and nurse. What is your stance on the focused celebration of Florence Nightingale?
Yes, bless her. Florence. I love Florence. I think what made me sad this year, well, one is I think 2020 may get rolled into 2021 because of everything that's happened and we haven't had time for celebration. But I respect Florence Nightingale and what she did, and I totally value her contribution to our profession. But my sadness this year was, why do we keep going back to Florence? Like, why can't we celebrate our leaders and our, you know, community and who we are? And I guess as a Black nurse, for me, that includes our traditional healing and birthing stuff that's happened for 60, 70, 80,000 years before I came along. So why can't we put ourselves front and centre rather than always linking back to a historical figure who, yes, did a lot for our profession, but for me, we should be celebrating our contemporary leaders and people that are here now who are making a real difference. I mean, we've got some phenomenal nurse researchers. We've got some phenomenal stories around traditional birthing and healing. You know, we should be celebrating that. So I guess for this year, what we've been doing and what I've personally been doing is trying to raise the profile of our Black nurses and midwives, because we're not only nurses and midwives, we're also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that brings value to the system. So about getting a platform and getting those voices out there. I absolutely support what the WHO have said, and I think nurses and midwives need to be recognised and more valued in the policy space, in government, in everywhere we can get our voices in, because we have a lot of value to add to the system and we have a lot of expertise. And I think sometimes we're the quieter voice because we're always there busy doing our work. we forget how much power we have as a collective profession, and we should use that power for our benefit, you know. So, because who's the one who's sitting by the bedside all the time listening to patients? We know a lot of stuff that we need to use in a political way to get our voices out there. But I'm absolutely with what the WHO intent was. It's around raising the profile and raising our image. And I think sometimes we're the forgotten professions that just get on and do it, you know. So, bless Florence, I love her. But yeah, she did do some research in the Aboriginal health space, and she also wrote some things that were, yeah, questionable. So,
okay. This is, once again, like I said, not related to that one, but so I believe you've got some cops in the family.
I have, yes, two of them. Yeah.
So this is, I guess, a topical question, but do you think the disproportionate criminalisation of Indigenous youth leads to a mistrust of the border system, in particular the health system?
I think our young people are really struggling, and I don't think this is just an Australian thing. I think it's a worldwide thing. Anyone who comes from a different background culturally struggles with any sort of, I guess, organisations and institutions, and the police are no different. I was thinking today of a young guy, I don't know if any of you would be aware of a young guy called Elijah who lived in a town called Kalgoorlie in the goldfields of Western Australia, and a fairly racist town, but has a big Aboriginal population. Elijah was accused of stealing a motorbike from a local non-Aboriginal guy, and there was a bit of an altercation, and it was questionable whether the police told him where to find Elijah or whether he found him himself. But he ended up running him over and killing him, and he didn't even have the bike. And this guy got like a sentence, but it wasn't a huge sentence for what he had done. But Elijah was only 14, and that for me is what's sad about our youth, is that they're represented in the justice system. And I think they do have a mistrust. So I genuinely have the same fear, and I'm sure all people do. When police pull me over, I am really petrified, and I think some of that's from trauma in childhood. And I haven't even done anything wrong. Do you know what I mean? But you just have that fear of police. And I think we've got to have a fear of police because they have a role to play. But how do we get our young ones to say, you know, you might have, you know, uncle's been in jail, auntie, whoever, that's their whole life, but that doesn't have to be the road for you. What's another road that you could go on that's going to be more positive? Getting educated is really important, finishing school, going to university, going to TAFE, whatever it is, to pull yourself out of that, the pit of despair, I guess, that people get into and they get caught up with. And our young people have a real innate trust of authority. I think it's a teenager thing as well. Like, we don't trust adults when we're teenagers. But especially our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people are really struggling with the system. And I guess everyone saw that video of that young guy being brought down to the ground in Sydney there. There's a lot of issues going on, and there's a lot of work being done to try and sort that. My two cousins that are both police officers, they do a really great job. And I guess we just need more Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the police force as well. But we also need to educate our youth that there's other roads to go on, you know. Going to jail is not a good thing. Yeah. So how do you get them on another road, especially when they live in a small town like Elijah did, you know, where pretty much just being a naughty kid can get you into a lot of trouble. And how do we get those kids on a different road, whether it's through sport, whether it's through education? You know, how do we get them engaged in the system? And there is that direct correlation between justice and health, because a lot of the prisons, you know, people who are in prison have mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues, and other issues, health issues going on. But how do we get them out of that system and transition back into society and feeling like they're part of a society and feeling like they have value and they're seen and their voice is heard? And kids get targeted all the time. And it is a thing when you go into a store, if you are of a different race, you do get followed around by security, and it does happen. And like I have this argument with my fair skinned friends and they're like, no, it doesn't. And I'm like, yes, it does.
Not
And
to
I will
them.
actually walk
Yeah.
out of a store if someone follows
Yeah.
me. Like I won't do it. But their young people are seeing that all the time. Like no one trusts us. And I think the Australian Dream story and hearing Adam's story, what made our community really sad is that no matter how good he was, he still got treated badly by Australia. And I think that's terrible. You know, and kids look up to Adam. He's a hero in our community. But then you see all that bullying and the terrible behaviour that happened towards him, and kids then feel torn. You know, they're like, "Oh, well, Adam's my hero," but the rest of Australia, you know, this small minority, I guess, don't see how good he is and what he brings to society, and that affects kids. I think they need
Yeah.
those role models and those heroes to look up to. And what I do a lot is go into schools and talk about different pathways, and I'll take some of the young male nurses with me because I'm a woman and I'm getting
Yeah.
older now, so I take some of the younger girls as well to share
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
story because they were like those kids in school, didn't know what to do, didn't have a pathway. And I think that's where promoting nursing and midwifery is a really good way to get them interested in health and also wanting to help their community as well. So,
And that goes exactly to Daz's next question, which was how do we encourage more Indigenous people to take up nursing? And I guess another question I've got for you is, do you find that a lot of Indigenous nurses burn out quite quickly and they leave the profession?
big time, yeah. Yeah.
And why is that? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one of the ways I've always said to get more of our people into nursing and midwifery is just around getting the stories out there of people who've done the pathway and now practicing. So sharing those stories. So we've done quite a bit of work on creating like pathways booklets for community where they've got images of different Aboriginal people or Torres Strait Islander who've gone through and got a career. Sharing those positive stories, like I don't know, sharing, like even doing this, maybe there might be someone watches, they tell a friend, and then they share that story. I think, back to your other question, I think it's difficult because people don't know the pathways into nursing and midwifery, and I see this even with mainstream kids. They don't understand what an enrolled nurse is versus a registered versus a midwife. There's a
Yeah.
lot of confusion. And then how do you get into that? What subjects do you need? So that real practical help, I think, is really important in school as well. I certainly help a lot of family friends who are interested in nursing but don't know the pathways
The
and just
process.
guide them through that process. And I think it's just having those role models, out there who promote it. I go into schools a lot and talk about my journey and what it was like being a country kid and then, coming back. But getting them back into community as well is a challenge. There's a big issue around retention of our nurses and midwives, and I've just started a bit of research to look into that. What's going on? Why are we not retaining? So we're getting a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander grads into the system. They're doing about 2 or 3 years and then they're burning out and then they're
Okay.
going off and doing other jobs, and some of them are going into community health, which is a good thing. But
Yeah.
some of them are going into other professions altogether. And I want to understand what that is. And I don't have the answers yet because no one's really done that research. I
Okay.
suspect, and I'm one of the few that did 18 years straight, I suspect that there's some issues going on within that. A lot of grad nurses aren't staying in our profession, and I think that's a big worry for us as well. What's going on? Is it about that you go through uni, you get your degree, which is a massive achievement, and then you go, maybe I don't want to work shifts. Maybe it's the shift work, maybe it's the night duty, maybe it's the pay, maybe it's not feeling valued in the system. Like there's something there. I think we've got to do a bit of work to explore
And
what
find
that
it. Yeah.
is. We've started sort of doing some interviews with, I guess, some early career nurses and midwives just to explore what's going on for them and why. Some of it's racism as well, from the other staff. My space, I'm a paediatric nurse. You tend to get a lot of older nurses, and I'm in the old category, but I'm like the older, where they don't treat our younger nurses properly, they're
Yeah.
disrespectful. like nurses do eat their young, and that's a problem, and that's not something to be proud of. That's something for us to be ashamed of and do something about. So I think that sort of stuff, and I'm a big person for mentoring. I've been mentoring nurses for years. You know, I've looked after Irish nurses, English nurses, whoever, because I don't ever want to be known as a nurse that eats her young, because I think that's disgusting and we should be ashamed of that. So a big push for me is to say, once they're in the system, how can we help? How can we support grads? And I'll look after any grad, I don't care who they are, to get them through whatever's going on for them, you know. So we are doing some research to explore what that is, and we will be publishing an article in the next couple of months, and we'll probably share that through you, Jackson, to give to your members.
Yeah, please do.
To talk about it, yeah.
I think that would create some good discussion as well, because it's not just Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander nurses. The things that you find will probably reflect the profession more widely.
Yeah. There's a big piece of work done in the United States about retention of grad nurses as well, and they found a lot of the issues I think will be similar. We're going to find as well. So.
Yeah. So the National Aboriginal and Islanders Day Observance Committee, which is this top I'm wearing.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, it's a cool top. Is an observance in Australia lasting from the first Sunday in July until the following Sunday. And we were actually planning to interview back then, but that didn't work. And it still celebrates Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, culture, and so the achievements of the community. So this is my second last question, and we'll probably wrap it up. But what should we do to celebrate the achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses more often?
I think we're getting a bit more of a profile now. I don't know, the last 3 years through the HESTA Nursing and Midwifery Excellence Awards, we've had winners, which is great. A couple of midwives and one of the nurses as well won, which is fantastic. I think this year there's been a lot of work through the Australian College of Nursing in the Hive magazine. We've done a couple of articles about some of our nurses. And same with the ANMJ as well. Just trying to do those stories to tell that contrasting story against, you know, International Year of the Nurse and Midwife, but also share some of our achievements as well. I think it's just about getting our images out there. I try and get in the newspapers, in the mainstream papers, and on NITV did a bit of a campaign just to thank all of our health professionals, all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ones. So how do we sort of shift that into mainstream? NAIDOC Day will be very different, or NAIDOC Week will be very different this year because of COVID and we can't have big community gatherings. But NAIDOC Week is our biggest week of the year when we do showcase the work that we do as nurses and midwives and as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think just being aware of who's around you, like if you're working in a big hospital or a particular ward or an area, ask those questions. Who are our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff? You know, most hospitals have an Aboriginal liaison service now. Get to know them, but put that support out there. Like even if you're at uni or whatever, find out who's around you. You know, get to know the other people that you're studying with or you're working with. And just recognise that, you know, you have a role to play, even if you're not Indigenous, you still have a role to play in caring for our patients and families, and get yourself educated and ask lots of questions. And sometimes you're going to get it wrong and it's not a bad thing, you know, and there's a lot of us out there who will help you, you know, and certainly I help a lot of people when there's different scenarios where they need advice or whatever. But yeah, just recognise that we're out there, we're not invisible. We might not look exactly how you think we should look, you know, maybe our skin's not that dark, but we still identify and we're still proud of our culture. And, you know, it'd be great to have our non-Indigenous nurses and midwives on our side as well. And let's all work together, I think, to make a better system. And, you know, we're a good country, and yes, there's racists, but they're everywhere. You know, you're never going to get rid of them. But, you know, let's work together as one and make this a better country and a better health system.
I think there are some very strong words. And if you had a final message, what would you like to give? Sorry, if you had a final message to give to nurses about caring for Indigenous groups, what would that be?
I think
I guess you just
Yeah, look, you're going to get it wrong. Nobody's perfect. I think if you come in with that respect and you are a good listening, take that time to listen and be comfortable with silence. Silence is a good thing, and I think we always want to be helping and talking as clinicians, but being okay with just sitting and being. And that's where I said at the beginning about mindfulness. I think it's a really important skill to have. Um, because sometimes we need to just sit still with patients and families and just listen and hear what they have to say. But showing respect and understanding that sometimes you don't understand what's going on, but wanting to look at it a bit different. Don't put your own views and your own opinions on things. Actually have an open mind, ask questions, and challenge yourself to think a bit different. And I always use the example of with children, our kids are raised by a village, they're not raised by their parents. So when they come into hospitals, they might be doing things like jumping on the couch or running around loud that you don't let your kids do at home. But that's a different way of raising your children, and that's not a good or a bad thing. But don't put your judgment on other people if their kids are going a bit mad, because you might raise your kids different. And you see that a lot in shopping centres, I always feel sorry for parents when their kids are chucking a tantrum, because I remember what that was like for me as a parent, that sometimes you raise your kids different to other people, and that doesn't make them a bad parent and you're a good parent. We just do it different. So I think just be mindful that sometimes we put our own opinions and beliefs on other people, and that's not a good thing. So
consciously and unconsciously.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up. I think we've touched on a myriad of great sort of themes and things that I think people are going to get something from. I hope everyone who's been watching and who's listening in the future enjoyed it, and I think there's a lot to take from what Melanie's talked about. Yeah, I have no further words, but to say a massive thank you to you for coming along and hopefully sharing. I mean, I did look in and I couldn't find an Aboriginal nurse who had spoken just, to a broader Australian nursing community, and to allow that conversation. So I think this is potentially the first that's happened. I think we need to do this more, so we might see more of Melanie in the future if I can coerce her onto the show.
Great. Thank you, Jackson. And thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure. And I'm happy to come back anytime and do particular subjects or whatever you need. Just let me know. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, no problem. I'll speak to you after, okay?
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.